GPO Pirate Hunters. Not technically the name they went by back in the day, but as a job description it's perfect. In recent videos I told you about a man called Gordon Yates. He was the Manchester GPO chap who chased the guys from pirate radio station Radio Aquarius all around Stockport and the surrounding areas. Flanked by groups of GPO men, these lead pirate hunters made it, in some cases their life's work, to take these pirate stations off the air, and in some cases their drive and somewhat obsessive actions cost them their careers. We won't go into the history of pirate radio here because we'd need hours, but basically when the offshore pirates were brought to their knees by the Marine Offences Act, a new spectrum of pirates were born, transmitting from outside spaces, derelict buildings, tower blocks and just about anywhere. These pirates were now land-based and they were illegal, and the GPO, later the DTI, the Radio Investigation Service, whatever it was at a certain period in time, basically arms of the government under different names, had the task of removing these pirates from the airwaves. So I thought we'd look at some of the big names in the GPO and the DTI world that became household names in the pirate radio fraternity. The General Post Office set up the Radio Services Department, which was responsible for taking these pirates off the air, and it was led by numerous people who will cover, along with, in no particular order, some of the men that worked for the department under its different guises over the years. And this will give us a chance to go through some of the amusing and not so amusing stories that these men and the pirate stations were involved in. Brian Copsey worked for the GPO, but he wasn't one of the bad guys, so to speak. Nick Catford from Radio Jackie South recalled an incident when one of the station's DJs, Mike Barron, threw a hot cup of coffee over Brian. The guys at the station felt sorry for him, so gave him a lift back to his car in one of their lookout vehicles, and Brian was appreciative of that gesture. London Stereo broadcast from Pilgrim's Hall on the top of Reigate Hill over Easter of 1975 on 94.6 MHz FM, 1331 kHz medium wave and 6225 kHz shortwave. Programmes were linked up from studios several miles away using a special UHF ultra-wideband FM studio to transmitter link. Needless to say, it was quickly apprehended and Brian Copsey led the raid, taking everything relating to the station away. Interestingly, by all accounts, Brian hated Eric Gotz, possibly one of the most well-known GPO men ever, who we'll come to later. By his own admission, Eric was the reason he left the GPO, as he couldn't stand him. Brian Williams was known as more of a good guy, unlike some of the others. He took many stations off the air but was never violent and always quite civil. He was one of the main members of the GPO's investigation team, along with Eric Gotz and Victor Frisbie. You can see Brian here in 1969, taken from a flat in Sutton Common Road in Sutton. He was looking for Radio Jackie South, but they managed to turn the transmitter off and take the aerial down quickly enough to foil the raid. Peter Goodin was described as overzealous in his pursuit of regulatory enforcement. During a raid on a station in Essex, acting on a magistrate's warrant, he failed to wait for the police officer in uniform, who had to accompany every right to enter, test and search for radio equipment. The householder, being equally overzealous in protecting his home and family, attacked Peter and two of his colleagues before the police officer arrived. Wireless telegraphy went by the wayside in this case, and assault charges were brought against the man, which led to his subsequent conviction. He was, however, acquitted on appeal. The case was funded by radio enthusiasts across the south of England and became a landmark case, with the Home Office guidance insisting that its radio regulatory teams had the warrants served by uniformed police. Peter Goodin was responsible for busting the last rock pirate on FM, Rock 106. The raid happened to go out live as Nigel Grant was on the air. Peter's career with the GPO and later the RA was quite a long one. In 2000, two men from Grays in Essex assaulted him. This was a very different world of pirate radio compared to decades gone by. The 20 and 21-year-olds were convicted of assault following investigations by Radio Communications Agency officers into an Essex pirate radio station. Goodin and another officer were involved in investigating Syndicate FM, which transmitted in the area of Grays, Basildon and Dagenham and traced its whereabouts to Keir Hardy House in Milford Road in Grays. On the 8th of January 2000, the officers recovered a radio transmitter from the roof area of the building and, upon leaving, they were both confronted by two men who demanded the return of the transmitter. Goodin and the other officer refused, so one of the men pulled the transmitter from Peter's grasp, injuring his hand in the process. Both men pleaded guilty in court to assaulting Goodin, and they were each given 18 hours community service and ordered to pay £50 compensation each, and costs of £55 were awarded against each of them. Victor Frisbie was known as a thug who liked to punch people in the face. He lived in Delacourt Road in London SE3 and was part of a team with Eric Gotz. He's seen here at Epsom in 1973. Moments after Nick Catford from Radio Jackie took this photo, Victor tried to punch him. Radio Nelson was one of the stations taken off the air by Victor in 1971. It broadcast on 201 metres medium wave from West London in 1971 and 1972 and suffered a GPO raid on March 5, 1972. They were broadcasting from 22 Caldershaw Road in West Ealing, funnily enough, an address they used on air for mail. At approximately 1:20 p.m, Frisbie, along with Eric Gotz and Brian Williams, as well as 6 police officers, arrived at the premises. The equipment was confiscated, and apparently the police officers were bewildered as to why they were there, which was not unusual in pirate radio raids. Stanley Smith led the GPO pirate radio department from its earliest days. On August 17, 1968, the day of the Free Radio Association rally in London, a station from 34 Addison Gardens in London broadcast on 204 metres. This was the first broadcast under the name Radio Free London. The broadcasters were reluctant to end their fun, and they continued past the planned close down at 4:30 p.m. Unknowingly, they played into the hands of the authorities, who had spent the day trying to locate the source of the illicit signal. At around 5:20, Stanley Smith and other post office engineers entered the makeshift studio. The DJ Chris Carey asked Stanley Smith to speak on air, but he refused and simply removed what he thought was the transmitter and left. None of the broadcasters were even asked their name, let alone prosecuted. In reality, the authorities left with a pile of junk, as the real transmitter was hidden inside a speaker cabinet. It was rumoured that inside the Bakelite housing for the crystal was a note saying, "Now find the real transmitter." William Leslie Crowe, or Jim Crowe, was a much calmer man. He never exceeded his authority and was always civil. Brian Horn used to ring him at home the night before a Radio Jackie transmission and asked him if he was out tomorrow. He'd often reply with "No, nobody's out." He was always true to his word, and if he said there wouldn't be a raid, there wasn't a raid. The GPO team was actually led by William Crowe after Stanley Smith. Jim was known for his leniency in dealing with pirates and often turned a blind eye on many occasions. When he raided the station at Swinging Radio England in Shepperton, he ignored the glowing valves of the medium wave transmitter and concentrated on a defunct ex-Army No. 19 set, which he agreed could not transmit. He can be seen here with Brian Horn at Surbiton Crown Court in 1974. Brian was a pirate radio legend, and Jim Crowe was a GPO pirate hunter. Confused? Well, Jim was taking numerous items from a raid to his car and was struggling, so Brian offered to help him, and Jim obliged. Not much is known about Ron Dalton. He was head of the Sussex division of the GPO and had a black Wolseley car with the reg BLO 802H. He chased the guys who ran the station Focus 240 every weekend but never caught them. Gordon Yates is one of the GPO men I featured in the series on Radio Aquarius. He was relentless in his efforts to take the station off the air and did so several times. Gordon, along with Leo Harrington, Ron Baird and Bob Kenworthy, led all the raids on the Manchester stations, and he cornered the Radio Aquarius team at Heald Green Station after they tried to escape. After Eric Gotz was on scaled-back duties following his conviction for assault, Gordon was brought down to London to lead the raid on Radio Jackie in 1985, which led to its closure. Gordon and his mob often called into microwave modules in Liverpool for a tea break if they were in the area, which they often were because of Eric Haydock's station Radio Jackie North. Gordon knew the guys at microwave modules had been helping Eric for some time as they made odd comments, but they just laughed it off. Brian Holder lived in Eltham in London, and he was most commonly seen with Eric Gotz. His post office car was a Hillman Hunter estate with the registration ALT 876H that used to be parked up outside his house. This provided a useful source of information for Radio Jackie, who had a member of staff nearby. He would stay by the car from around 10 AM till midday. If the car didn't move, it was a good indication that there would be no raids that day. The member of staff would report the result in by phone to Nick Catford's house, and if a raid looked likely, Nick would go to the site and make sure everybody knew. Brian apparently retired from the GPO many years ago and went on to start a mobile radio business in Bristol. And finally, that brings us to Eric Gotz. But don't worry, there's lots more names coming up who I don't have any recollections or information on, but you may remember. Eric Gotz is the most well-known pirate hunter ever employed by the GPO, and probably one of the very few still alive from the early days of the Radio Services Department. He was notorious for his violent temper when carrying out raids, and certainly exceeded his power and made it his life's work to take the pirates off the air. From 1978, Radio Jackie was helped by significantly reduced activity from the Radio Interference Service investigators. This is because, at a raid by the Hogsmill River in Tolworth, the station's engineer Mike Barrington was assaulted by Eric. Mike pressed charges and Eric was convicted and given a 12-month discharge with £350 in costs. He unsuccessfully appealed and his bosses considered his position. Although he kept his job, the promotion to head of the department that he was in line for was allegedly taken from him. Eric's time with the DTI continued into the 1990s, when in 1992 he raided a station and, in the presence of a police officer, started to smash the studio equipment up and push the station operators around physically. The station owner said he had a smile on his face as he did it and described him as an animal. When the DJ tried to reason with him and stop him damaging the studio, the police officer told him to sit down. Interestingly enough, Eric worked with Chris Winton in the early 1990s, who's actually a genuinely pleasant guy who can be seen in a couple of the 1990s pirate radio documentaries. I always try to be fair and would never want to portray anyone other than what these first-hand accounts do from those who ran into Eric over the years. It seems he wasn't all bad though. When he raided Phase 106.4 with Peter Goodin in 1992, he let the station owner keep his handheld studio monitor radio. He did, however, take everything else. Today, Eric is 90 years old and living in Chelmsford in Essex, and he's still alive and well.